This is a story about the Lighthouse Keeper's lunch, and we're going to be looking at this book for your home challenges all week. And if you are at school, we'll be looking at this at school. Okay, it's an old-fashioned book. It was written a long time ago, but it's a very sweet little story involving Mr Grinling, involving his lunch, and involving these pesky seagulls. And we know how cheeky these seagulls are, don't we? Because where we go to school, we have seagulls trying to pinch our lunch and things when we're on the field. Okay, and this is written by a lady and a man called Rhonda and David Armitage. So let's have a look. And there she is, Mrs Grinling. This is Mr Grinling's wife. The Lighthouse Keeper's lunch. Oh, and I can see 1, 2, 3 seagulls wanting to delve deeply into Mr Grinling's lunch. Can you see the grapes? And I imagine he's got some delicious sandwiches and some fruit. And I also can see a chicken leg, chicken drumstick there. The Lighthouse Keeper's lunch. Once there was a lighthouse keeper called Mr Grinling. At night time he lived in a small white cottage perched high on the cliffs, and in the daytime he rowed his rowing boat out to the lighthouse on the rocks to clean and polish the light. Mr Grinling was the most industrious lighthouse keeper. Come rain or shine, he tended his light. Just about see him here, can you? All the page has been smudged. It must have got smudged in the rain, but it's nice and bright here in the sun. Sometimes at night, as Mr Grinling lay sleeping in his warm bed, the ships would toot to tell him his light was shining bright and brightly and clearly out to sea. You can see the lighthouse shining brightly, and there's Mr Grinling fast asleep. Each morning, while Mr Grinling polished the light, Mrs Grinling worked in the kitchen of the little white cottage on the cliffs, concocting a delicious lunch for him. Once she had prepared the lunch, she packed it into a special basket and clipped it onto the wire that ran from the little white cottage to the lighthouse on the rocks. You can see the lighthouse there. Can you see Mr Grinling here rowing his boat all the way out to the lighthouse where he works? But one Monday, something terrible happened. Mrs Grinling had prepared a particularly appetising lunch. She had made a mixed seafood salad, a lighthouse sandwich, a cold chicken garni, sausage and crisps, a peach surprise, some iced sea biscuits, some drinks and assorted fruit, and she packed the lunch in the basket as usual and sent it down the wire. She is smiling, Mr Grinling's pussycat is smiling, and there's his lunch just about to go down on the wire. But the lunch did not arrive. It was spotted by 3 scavenging seagulls who set upon it and devoured it with great gusto. "Clear off you," shouted Mr Grinling, but the seagulls took not the slightest bit of interest. Mr Grinling looking very cross because they'd eaten his lunch. Let's read what the seagulls say. "Scrumptious lunch, Tom. She's a great cook, Fred. This is an excellent peach surprise, boys." Look, they took everything out of the lunch and they threw the napkin into the sea. That evening, Mr and Mrs Grinling decided on a plan to baffle the seagulls. "Tomorrow I shall tie the napkin to the basket," said Mrs Grinling. "Of course, dear," agreed Mr Grinling. "A sound plan." And you see, she's tied the napkin to the basket so the seagulls won't be able to get in. Or will they? Can you see what they've done? They've undone the ribbon. And the speech bubble here says they'll have to try harder than this to stop us, Bert. They're so cheeky, those seagulls, aren't they? So cheeky. On Tuesday evening, Mr and Mrs Grinling racked their brains for another plan. "They are a brazen lot, those seagulls," said Mrs Grinling. "Brazen indeed," said Mr Grinling. "What shall we do?" "Our cat doesn't appear to like seagulls," said Mrs Grinling. "No, my dear," said Mr Grinling. "Hamish is an accomplished seagull chaser." "Of course," exclaimed Mrs Grinling. "Tomorrow Hamish can guard the lunch." "A most indigenous plan," agreed Mr Grinling. Hamish, the cat, did not think the plan was indigenous at all. He spat and hissed as Mrs Grinling secured him in the basket. There, Hamish," said Mrs Grinling consolingly. "I have a tasty piece of herring waiting for you when you arrive home." Just see the lighthouse in the back. Sadly, flying did not agree with Hamish. His fur stood on end when the basket swayed, and his whiskers drooped when he peered down at the wet blue sea. He felt much too sick to even notice the seagulls, let alone scare them away. "Oh, Hamish, you didn't do a very good job of protecting the lunch, did you?" And the seagull's speech bubbles say, "Pretty pussy, like a piece of lobster mornay." "This food gets better every day, Fred. And this cheeky one here says, 'Aren't you going to chase us, pussy?'" "Well, does Hamish look like he's going to be chasing anyone?" "I don't think so. He looks far too scared." "Lackaday," said Mr Grinling sadly. "Meow, meow," agreed Hamish pitifully. On Wednesday evening, Mr and Mrs Grinling racked their brains again for a new plan. "What shall we do?" said Mr Grinling. Mrs Grinling looked thoughtfully. "I have it," she exclaimed. "Just the mixture for hungry seagulls." "Indeed, my dear," said Mr Grinling. "What do you have in mind?" "Wait and see," said Mrs Grinling. "Just wait and see." "Mustard sandwiches," chuckled Mr Grinling. "A truly superb plan, my dear. Truly superb. Extra strong mustard in those sandwiches." On Thursday morning, Mrs Grinling carefully packed the mustard sandwiches and sent them off down the wire to the expectant seagulls. "Oh, they all say yuck. The seagulls hate mustard sandwiches." On Friday, Mrs Grinling repeated the mustard mixture. "All right, boys, let's go and have lunch elsewhere," said the seagulls. "It's the same as yesterday's lunch, Fred, and we hate mustard sandwiches." So on Saturday, up in the little white cottage on the cliffs, a jubilant Mrs Grinling put away the mustard pot before she prepared a scrumptious lunch for Mr Grinling. While he waited for his lunch, down on the lighthouse on the rocks, Mr Grinling sung snatches of old sea shanties as he surveyed the coastline through his telescope. And this is what he saw. He saw those 3 pesky seagulls stealing the lunch from the fisherman. And they say, "No mustard in this lot, Tom. We'll fly back here for lunch tomorrow, boys. Oh, this is a delicious chocolate eclair, Fred." So the seagulls didn't disturb Mr Grinling anymore. They disturbed the fisherman, and Mr Grinling said, "Oh, well, such is life," mused Mr Grinling as he sat down to enjoy a leisurely lunch in the warm sunshine. So eventually Mr Grinling, the lighthouse keeper, got his truly scrumptious lunch. I hope you enjoyed the story as much as I did. Enjoy doing your activities from this story. Bye for now.